First, we're going to complete our discussion of stagflation. Last Tuesday, we talked about that we're going to be doing, or we talked about the inflationary portion. Now we're going to talk about the stagnant growth portion and what's causing that and how that all plays out. So let's go ahead and fire up with stagflation part 2. All right, I'll give you a little background, set the stage here. In 2021, hopes were that inflation was a result of some short-term factors related to the restart of the economy due to COVID. So when COVID happened, for those of you that weren't aware, a lot of people, of course, were not laid off, but had to work from home, or in a lot of cases in factories and things like that, they actually, couldn't go in to work. And basically everything except the farm economy was shut down. The farm economy had to keep going, production of food. And there were some big issues there with people in meat packing plants, everybody getting sick and that type of thing. But essentially, the farmers, of which I'm one, kept going and continued that supply chain, but everybody else kind of shut down or tapered off some of their growth. So when everything restarted in 2021, there was a short-term spike in inflationary pressures because there were very few supplies of goods and some services, and there was a built-up, pent-up demand for those things. And so the hope was it was a short-term issue. Also, there were some industry-specific shortages that occurred as a result of, frankly, some stupid decisions on some of the industry leaders' parts. For example, the auto industry shifted their entire use of semiconductors from American-made to Chinese-made and Taiwanese-made. And what happened is, as we've talked for the last year and a half or so, we couldn't get those things in. I mean, they weren't making them in China, and then when they were shipping them, we couldn't offload them here quick enough. And whole industries like the production of automobiles in this country shut down, and that rippled down into other part suppliers, so on and so forth. So that was a big problem. And once again, it was not necessarily caused by COVID as much as we had the ability to make those things here. Previously we had, but in order to save a penny, Detroit decided, let's go ahead and buy these things from China. Now, there were some smart companies. Tesla was one. Tesla, when there was a shortage of semiconductors and chips for their cars, went out and said, screw that, we're going to build our own chip factory, we're going to make our own stuff. And they were able to be successful and still provide Tesla autos during the shutdown. But anyway, that shut down the auto industry and a lot of the components. So when everything got restarted, and it's taken much longer for this thing to restart than everybody's expecting, we had, and we still have today, a shortage of goods and services. Now, you guys have all seen this if you've gone out to eat, or you've gone to a store like a Starbucks type thing where they're still having rotating outages. And it's because they have not been able to get enough employees to restock these things. That has also manifested it into some manufacturing facilities around the country, but not at that high of a level. We talked last November about that month, or actually early December, about the month of November being the worst month ever for people quitting their jobs. It was the highest amount of folks that had ever quit their jobs. And millions of people, for some reason, in November last year, walked away from their employment. Now, what you don't hear in the news today is that last month was one of the largest hiring months ever. And a lot of these manufacturing positions around the country and some of the deeper level economic activities that we don't see, in other words, except for the Starbucks and the restaurants and things like that, these people are now staffed, these companies are now staffed back up to full supply. So there isn't really a shortage of goods. Now, there is still a problem with regards to services, and there's a lag in production. Once again, because a lot of people who are in that frontline service industries of things like Starbucks, I'm not picking on Starbucks, just something everybody understands, Starbucks and some of the restaurants and things like that, they have not been able to restaff because, frankly, a lot of folks wanted to, quit that type of employment. Because they were front lines, they tended to get COVID at a higher rate, and people just rethought their lives, decided not to do that. So that has been some of the real factors behind why we've gotten a stagnant economy, a longer drawn out period to achieve full production. I believe that probably by next month we'll be at full production for everything except the frontline service industries. And then we have this frontline service industry issue, the server type issues that we talked about. However, the biggest problem in the supply chain right now is we have a manipulated market. And in a lot of aspects, these guys have taken a page out of the crypto world, where they've gone around and they are manipulating their own market without benefit of government assistance. So let's say, for example, the oil industry. We're not short oil nationwide. We're not short oil worldwide. Yes, Russia, which was the 5th largest producer, is basically unable to ship anything out, but we had an oversupply of oil, and we still do worldwide. But they're using that as an excuse to future price the price of oil. That's why it's gone up tremendous. In California here this last week, I saw things that range from $6.49 to $6.99 a gallon. It's crazy. And I know in some of these other states, it's significantly less. Of course, in California, we take everybody's money when we're short, and they take it vis-a-vis things like gasoline tax and some other stupid things we're going to talk about coming up here in a minute. But anyway, I believe there is a large-scale effort in a large amount of industries, specifically things like the oil industry, where it is being manipulated. They're using the fact that we are in an inflationary environment because of a mismanagement of some of the supply chains, but also, just where there's true shortages. And they're using that to, basically line their pockets. You're going to see probably starting in July, huge windfall profits for the oil companies and things like that. It's like, gee, we don't know what happened. We made a lot of money. Well, here's what happened. You jacked the price up. You guys colluded. I believe they got together, and I'm not making, that's my opinion. I'm not making that a public charge, but I'm under the belief that after studying all this stuff, there's a large amount of manipulation going on in a lot of industries to cause that. So we'll see what happens. We talked about the downside of stagflation. The last time we had this in the economy was about 50 years ago during the Nixon administration, and the Fed at that time was unable to raise prices fast enough, or raise interest rates fast enough to diminish the price increases. And when you raise interest, prices tend to be capped or go down, and that was unable to be successful then. President Nixon at the time stepped in and issued an executive order freezing all wages and price increases, and that did the trick. That stopped stagflation. My guess is that President Biden, that would be his thing that he could do to get this thing under control. It is not what we want to do as a country. However, it is the only thing in my belief that's going to work. And we're going to talk about that in this next segment, because interest rates can't be raised high enough and fast enough, in my opinion, to stop the stagflation runaway train. So that is the conclusion of our little mini series on stagflation, the inflationary part and the stagnant growth part. And, we'll be glad to talk about it more detail here in a month or so, when some of the tea leaves are a little easier to read. So that's it for that piece. All right.